Hey, welcome. Thank you for clicking. My name's Kevin. It's been a while since I did one of these videos. I've actually been thinking about this one a lot for over a period of time. Um, I get a lot of because I'm on social media talking about this subject pretty much every other day on Twitter and have been for quite some time. So I've kind of seen things evolve over the last couple of years. And it seems that I'm experiencing more and more people kind of come at me and attack me, um, and they're using a lot of base assumptions because of the reality that I am transsexual, and they're kind of coming at me, kind of presuming a lot of, I think this, I think that. I'm coming from this position. I must hold these beliefs because I am trans. Um, and there's not a hell of a lot I can do about that. Like people are going to make up their own minds. That's totally fine. Um, I also get a lot of kind of more moderate, more interested types of people who are interested in having conversations about how I, as a transsexual person who's been around for a couple of decades at this point, how I see the nuance of this subject and how I navigate my way through. Um, yeah, it's been interesting over the last year or so. I've seen the concept of people identifying as things come more and more. It's kind of concretizing in the language of gender critical spaces a lot more. You know, people identify. You get like females who identify as males, or women who think they're men, or men who think they're women. And if you don't have any actual real life interaction experience with transsexuals who have been around for a long time, then like it makes a lot of sense to use that language because we're really only seeing a couple of different types. We're only seeing a small number of things kind of reflected on social media, or perspectives reflected on social media over and over and over again. You have the youth demographic who are crying and having temper tantrums over being misgendered, or people not seeing them in the way that they want to be seen. But when they present, like people who present completely as female, being upset that someone who is a stranger to them or serving them somewhere calls them she instead of they, or she instead of he, or something like that, and they get upset and they do these videos. We see a lot of that, and then we also see a lot of like the older, really delusional, perverted men who think that they have these secret fetishes that they've had for a while, that suddenly there's this permissive queer theory has kind of permitted people to bring that into the public sphere more, and they're really getting out of hand with their delusionary, like guys that don't even, they're not even dressed feminine. They're 50 and 60-year-old men who are, making threats to people about, they are that anyone who doesn't see them as a woman, is a bigot and should watch their back, kind of, like just really delusional, disgusting behavior. And then the other thing that we see a lot of is allies who are kind of throwing it in your face and basically celebrating the indoctrination of children. Like I'm thinking about teachers who talk about, pride flags in their classroom, etc., etc. And those sorts of things get a lot of airtime on social media because they get a lot of clicks. What doesn't get a lot of clicks is, individual people who have been through the process and have quietly gone off and lived their life, who have tried not to draw attention to ourselves. So now when it comes time to actually speak out against this stuff, we don't have massive platforms from which to do that. So, we don't get heard that often. So I can completely understand why, like this trans identified language is becoming more and more prevalent, and it does work in a number of ways. I suppose the problem that I kind of see with it a little bit is that it's the problem of, you know, the forced teaming of the T is that, like we have several different distinct groups that are all being forced teamed under this title of trans, as though we're all the same thing and we're all coming from the same places and that we all have the same experiences, when that's, simply not true. I get a lot of raised eyebrows when I talk about the culture that existed that when I transitioned. Like, people kind of have this, people that have come into this debate kind of have this assumption that, and a lot of the research and stuff that's been done around this is kind of done from people who is from a perspective that wasn't within the community. So there's a lot missing. So people have the assumption that there just always was an ideology of what trans people always transitioned under this ideology, and before it was born in the wrong body, and now it's queer theory, which isn't actually really the case. I didn't know that there was an ideology until I bumped into Abigail Schreier's book. I bumped into a little bit of queer theory in the late 90s and the early noughties. But it was kind of really siloed into an academic, like people that had been in academia, who had done gender studies, who were doing like kinky performance art type intellectual stuff. Like, it existed in that realm, but that was very siloed off. And there is a large blue collar kind of ethic within the mainstream LGB and T communities. Well, T isn't really a community, so let's stick with LGB. There is kind of this blue collar ethic or dynamic that is through the LGB community, but it's not really very celebrated or sexy because it's blue collar. So what's presented in the media as LGB has always been glittery and party and fun, and that is the reality that does happen, but it's not the everyday reality of the entire thing. People don't party all week long, so it can give a false impression. So yeah, I bumped into people who were kind of into more sympathetic to the postmodern kind of queer theory stuff in the more performance arty realm of the LGB community, and that was, but it was pretty restricted to that area, and it stayed there for a really long time, like decades. So, yeah, it wasn't until I bumped into Abigail Schreier that I even really realised that there was an ideology that had, been fully formed and was operating over the top of, the LGBT community and the T and the Q in particular. Yeah, and it's just horrifying to realise. But before that was the case, when you think about the practical reality of, like, a lot of the older people who have been transitioned for decades and decades, like the longest at this time. If you ever think about it, they're often people who transitioned in their mid to early to late 30s. Like the decade of their 30s is where most people seem to have realized that transition would benefit them, and kind of, that's when a lot of them did that. So in my time frame, like, I transitioned when I was like 26, 27, and that was kind of on the early side to transition in that time frame. And when you think about the practicality of how that played out in real time, people kind of sat, for a decade or two, knowing that they were gender dysphoric, struggling with whether they wanted to transition or not. And this was like a really taboo subject. So quite often it wasn't until people were going into, pardon me, a therapist or a doctor's office to discuss this, that they actually really were, that people were actually discussing this with another living person for the first time. Like people spent decades alone with their thoughts before they ever kind of then stepped onto the process of trying to decide whether they wanted to transition or not. From my experience and what I saw up close, like people sitting with the reality of your dysphoria for decades alone by yourself, being alone with your thoughts, like that's a long time to be alone with your thoughts. And obviously people make up their own mind over time what they think, why they think they're trans, why they think they have gender dysphoria. And it seemed to me to be the case that quite often, most of the time, people really had made up their mind by the time they got to the doctors. So they're really like, which means that there's a lot of individual, like no two people really think alike. There's not a lot of information out there. I came into the community and discovered that there were a lot of a lot of individualistic approaches as to like people thinking that they were trans because of this or they had gender dysphoria because of that. Like there wasn't a general consensus that held the majority in any one way or the other. It was, very individualistic. Like the born in the wrong body thing was kind of this heuristic that kind of sat at media level. And I did know a few people that tried to make that work, but as everybody is now fully well aware, that kind of falls apart under a small amount of scrutiny. So it seemed to me that, like as trans people themselves, like trans people ourselves, like the people that I knew that tried to make that work kind of seemed to give up after a while. And the theory of this is kind of so sticky that most people kind of put that in the too hard basket and focused on living their daily life and getting through and, setting up a successful situation where they could live their life discreetly in the way that they wanted to. And so there really wasn't, it just wasn't, there were so many different, different individual approaches that there wasn't a single overarching narrative of what trans was, of what it meant. The whole point of transition, like the point of the entire thing was to transition successfully, which meant focusing on getting yourself to passing level as much as possible. Lots of people, like a lot of people had all of the surgeries early on. By the time I came along, that not so much, but it was still, the focus was still very much on passing full time. Like being successful meant, like the whole point, if just the whole point was, if you were going to transition, you needed to do it successfully, which meant that you needed to pass. It didn't mean that you needed to absolutely be stealth. Like being successful didn't necessarily mean being stealth. It certainly meant being private about it. You didn't necessarily want everybody, like down in the corner shop knowing that you were trans. But the focus was to transition, pass, go off and integrate and live a quiet, quiet life. Drawing attention to ourselves was kind of the last thing most people wanted to do. So when it comes to then pushing back against this ideology, there are only a handful of transsexual people that actually have platforms big enough to draw attention to the issue and get our voices out there. I know dozens and dozens of transsexual people, like anywhere up to 100 just on Twitter alone, that I have interactions with who are trying their best to speak out publicly against queer theory and gender ideology and the transing of people that are against the indoctrination of children, don't want this taught in schools, think that it is absolutely nonsensically crazy. But getting traction is a problem. Like, people are, it's just really difficult to get your voices out there, because we previously thought that building large platforms was antithetical to, being successful in life. Yeah, so back to the identifying. I kind of really thought about this a lot and over the last couple of months. Um, and I've looked at it from a number of different angles, because I don't want to be lazy in my thinking. And I've also chatted to a couple of I've chatted to a couple of other transsexuals about how they make sense of the process as well. And it's not that I didn't ever, like, I didn't think that I was transitioning to be a male or a man. Um, that's not. I knew I would pass as a man, but that didn't make me so. Um, I kind of always have seen my transition and my life very chronologically. Like, so I was a lesbian who decided to take testosterone um, at about 18 months into the process of taking testosterone. I was pretty much fully passing, which kind of, meant that a name change was necessary, in order to be not disruptive in society. And Kevin was a nickname that a certain part of my friendship circle already called me Kev, which is why I kind of went with that. The way I saw my transition and my life, and then therefore my larger identity, has been very chronological from the beginning. Like, it's been step by step by step. Like, I didn't ever really, like, the idea that I was reading in Helen Joyce's book about, that, like, the AGPs that think that they have a woman inside, like that was not really, like, Kev is not a completely different, person or persona than who I was before. Like, I didn't, I don't see it that way. I always saw it as an evolution in terms of, like, I took testosterone and these are the results. So I don't, transsexual is a descriptive label for me. It's not really an identity label. Um, I do get a lot of interest from people when I talk about this stuff. People do seem to be interested in it, and they do say they find it helpful. So at the end of the day, I'm not here to change anybody's, mind, or make anybody's mind up for them about anything. All I can do is talk about the culture that I transition into and my understanding of the history of how we got here from the inside perspective. And people are going to, do with that what they will, whether they find it helpful or not. All I can do is make the offer. I think the forced teaming is a problem. Like, talking about trans identified people in terms of transsexual people who are already fully pass and who live their lives in the opposite role in society. I think calling people that pass trans identified kind of misses the point a little bit. Like, the idea was to live your life. It wasn't to be a minority. So we kind of jettisoned, like, the idea of being identified as trans is not something that is important to me in any way, shape, or form. I see it as the process I went through, and I see it as a descriptive label that is rightly applied to my life. I think the people that are identifying, like the transgender type people who are identifying as trans visibly, or, like, vocally, are doing so because they are in fact not trans. If you have to identify yourself as a transsexual, then clearly you aren't. Not everybody passes, but you can tell if someone is making an effort or not. Um, and I think that while I understand people using the trans-identified female, trans-identified male, I think in some ways it really helps, and in other areas it really doesn't. But I mean, I'm a single individual person, and I'm not here to make your mind up for you. I'm just here to tell you what I know. Anyway, have a good day. I hope this helps.